Okay, Gwe, hello. Don DeLuisi, Mary Beth Doucette. I'm pleased to be here sharing this information with you about the Bedore Lakes SEPI Research Project, one of the Shared Future research projects that's based in Mi'kmaq territory in the district of Unama'ki, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. This is the fourth video of a number of short videos that I've pre-recorded to facilitate the knowledge sharing of the preliminary results of the Shared Future SEPI Research Project. So as in every presentation, I want to start by quickly reviewing the project objectives and highlighting where we are in the process. As a more detailed description of the research process was provided in the first presentation, and if you haven't reviewed that yet, I encourage you to do so. For this research project, there are two overarching objectives. First, we want to understand the possibilities, pitfalls, and complexities of implementing two-eyed seeing within a long-term intersectoral partnership focused on human land health. And secondly, we want to foster reflexivity, co-learning, and reconciliation within the SEPI by deepening SEPI members' understandings of Etowaptimunk two-eyed seeing, while strengthening your and our capacity and commitment to enact Etowaptimunk two-eyed seeing. And so in this video, we'll be talking about the individual identities and the relationships that individuals develop at the Bedore SEPI. I'll start by explaining why we believe individual identities and relationships are important to this discussion about the SEPI. I'll reflect on some complexities, pitfalls, and possibilities related to the topic of individual identities that came through in the interviews. And this is not because described their personal identity attributes necessarily. However, as people described others, by extension, they were positioning themselves within relationships that were apparently important. So in this presentation, we want to encourage everyone to think deeply about the gifts we each bring to the SEPI table. We also want to highlight the dynamic nature of individual identities and encourage everyone to think about how the changing relationships with people at the SEPI table may also change our relationship with the SEPI itself. And so in that vein, we will provide self-reflection questions instead of discussion questions. They're here to encourage everyone to individually think about who we are and how each of us is positioned relative to the others around the table. We'll also encourage you to think about when you joined or rejoined the SEPI and consider how that might influence your understandings of the work that SEPI does. Okay, so why are individual identities and relationships important to think about when participating at the SEPI table? In response to this question, I want to remind you of Charlie's vision for the SEPI, which I discussed in the last video. Charlie Joe imagined regular knowledge sharing discussions among people who have a responsibility to the Bedore Lakes, and he encouraged people to come to the table for honest, open-minded conversations. The more people who were there, the more we would collectively know about the watershed. And in this context, identity is important because our individual identities shape who we are, how we see the world, and what we see of the watershed. People will talk about themselves and others in conversations at meetings. And so the conversations about the watershed change as people around the table change. Therefore, the SEPI identity also may change as people around the table change. And this creates complexity. And so at a recent steering committee, at least the meetings that I've attended, we've been encouraged to share something about our relationship to the lakes and the watershed. Like that sharing exercise, we decided to bring forward these quotes to demonstrate the diversity of the perspectives that may be present at various SEPI conversations. And the first three quotes highlight the personal and long-standing relationships that people have with Unama'ki, Cape Breton, and with the Bedore Lakes watershed. Some people grew up in the community where they currently live. They may have been here for a while, or they may be retiring and building homes here. Some people may have come to Cape Breton a long time ago. For example, in the second quote, it's 1973. And when I look at the lakes, the last quote there talks about our sense of home being around the lakes. When I look at the lakes, I know I'm home. I know I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable on the land. I'm comfortable on the water. It's not something foreign to me. It's not something I feel disconnected from. And building from there, I also want to think about how the SEPI identity changes, or it changes with membership and attendance. The two quotes that are there just briefly highlight or point to how people are at the table for different reasons. Sometimes they're sitting as alternates for other people, and sometimes they're active for a while and then they're not as active as in the last 3 or 4 years, but then they rejoin because of a task team, because they've been asked because of their specialty or area of knowledge to come and participate. But it's often hard to participate in a way that they want to because it's difficult to get away from work. So there's that aspect of volunteerism. Um, Interviews revealed tension around the following identity constructs. Our personal and professional experiences can create tension. And so, for example, in our interviews, some of the points that were made most emphatically or with the most energy arose in relation to gender, professional expertise, sources of knowledge and culture, the presence and absence of Mi'kmaq and non-Mi'kmaq voices. But we also heard tension arise when people would talk about those who live in Unama'ki Cape Breton in comparison to those who live in other regions or at the table, representing regional and national positions. We heard tension when people would talk about how long they've been at the SEPI, or how long it's been since they were actively involved at the SEPI. And finally, there was tension about how and when we talk about money, who controls or influences, how and where funding is spent. I also want to note here that we didn't include direct quotes because when we were doing our interviews, these discussions often became tense when we started talking about some identities, and people would want to talk about them off the record. So we didn't include quotes, but we want to highlight that issue, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So first, what we've done again here is draw from academic research on identity and how intersectional identities play out in different circles and in different conversations. There is an increasing amount of research, academic research, that talks about identity and privilege and the compounding nature of power at work. A lot of these conversations talk about how dominant perspectives are taken for granted when you are from a statistically majority or representative group, and in contrast, when you're in a statistical minority position, it's often you're representing multiple minority positions at once. So this wheel of intersectionality is one type of a visual that can be used to encourage us to think reflexively about our various sources of power and privilege. And from the literature, some of the methods they suggest to follow when discussing um, organizational diversity and intersectionality is that you start by articulating your own salient intersectionalities, and then note how these intersections may play out in interpersonal, intrapersonal, and organizational conversations. For example, in this wheel, we present the identities that were most evident in the conversations about the SEPI. On the top, we have the voices and perspectives that have tended to dominate SEPI conversations over time. Those who have professional credentials are Canadian and male. On the bottom, those with statistically less power at the SEPI table are those who are less frequently represented, female, First Nations, and those who have less recognized scientific or academic credentials. The last point I'll make here is that there's also often a compounding effect. For example, women are often also First Nations, or First Nations may have less recognized credentials. And so when we look at the wheel, we think about the number of bodies that would be located on the top of the wheel and those that would be located on the bottom of the wheel. And when we do this, we begin to develop a heightened awareness, because as we developed a heightened awareness, it is believed that we can become more comfortable with uncertainty and also begin to see identity as a potential resource or can start to see gaps in the power dynamics. So if I was to illustrate this point briefly with my own personal experience, I feel I land somewhere in the middle of this wheel between Canadian and First Nations with credentials, multiple degrees, but I'm also female, and so sometimes on the bottom of the wheel. I benefit, the benefit of being in my position between multiple identities is that I feel very aware of tension when people have trouble explaining themselves. And in conversations with Carolyn, she similarly suggested it could be helpful to reflect on how often you're in a position of having to explain yourself, how often you feel the need to preface things because you know people aren't going to agree with you or they aren't going to see it from your perspective. And then building on the example of Carolyn and I, as we were doing the interviews, we often caught ourselves having to reinterpret conversations. And you might think that we would have a lot in common, and we do. For example, we both identify as cisgender female, we have experiences in academic research and teaching, and we both live in Cape Breton. But I've lived in Cape Breton my whole life. I've worked in Mi'kmaq communities as a status Indian, and I have 2.5 degrees in science and in business. Carolyn, in contrast, moved to Cape Breton in the last number of years, and she's worked around the lakes as a journalist. She also has 2 degrees, but they're in the social sciences. And so some of our similarities made it easy to work together, and we found ways to leverage our individual strengths to round out conversations. But inevitably, there were also points when we were not on the same page, and it took an unexpectedly long amount of time and energy to really think about where we were missing each other in the conversation. And we saw countless examples of this in our conversations and interviews as well. In the case of the CEPI organization, interactions and intersections of time and tenure with the organization or around the table are also sometimes points of tension. And we pointed this out in the first presentation about the CEPI timelines. People came into the conversations with different experiences with the CEPI, and some would recall meetings, stories, and often assume that everyone has similar or the same reference points, but they don't. And so these different reference points and access to stories may change the conversations about what CEPI should be doing and why certain projects should be prioritized or deprioritized. And although it's not reflected here, there's also many additional events that have happened in the last 5 years, and we're going to talk about those in the next couple of presentations as we start to move towards thinking about the work of the CEPI. Um, Basically, if you haven't been at the steering committee meetings recently, or you haven't been at all of the meetings that have been happening in the last couple of years, then you may not appreciate the significant changes in the communication and decision-making processes and how things have been prioritized over the last couple of years. So with this in mind, we want to move to talking about two-eyed seeing um, and how that might be a possibility when we're thinking about identity. So the quote that's here on the slide is from Elder Albert Marshall. If we can somehow embrace the spirit of collaboration, the spirit of co-learning to pool our gifts and resources together, if there's action needed, no one should feel left out or isolated. And I believe this is where we actually can demonstrate to you how the word jurisdiction could very well impede our initiative. Um, So when we think about Albert's words, sometimes he's saying a lot in a few short sentences. In this quote, as in many conversations, I hear him challenging us to pool our gifts and resources together, and no one can feel left out or isolated. Um, this refers again, I think, to when we're collaborating with others, how our identity lenses can create tension and make people feel left out or isolated. But if we use two-eyed seeing as a lens. We may also be able to reframe identities as gifts and leverage it for SEPI purposes to enrich the organization. And so if we're going to practice seeing the world from multiple different perspectives, we've listed a few of the perspectives that could be seen as valuable and that came out in our conversations with people as part of our interviews. The examples list here is not exhaustive. It's just some of the ones that were highlighted. For example, youth may have more energy and enthusiasm when they're coming to the table. Retirees may have more time available to dedicate to, like writing reports or thinking through things. Scientists come to the table to explain studies and do research, while politicians can listen to that research and advocate for the healthy watershed policies. The different locals around the table understand their environments and see the relevance of these issues daily. People who are not local come to the table and add a different perspective because they may have more appreciation for the difference between the conversations around the lakes and the conversations that are being held elsewhere. And finally, elders have lots of stories and they carry history and they carry experience that they can share that may inform our understanding of why we're doing work or how things have changed over a longer period of time. And so the question that we have now is, can SEPI be a place where important decisions about the watershed happen despite difficult and tense dialogues? And can we create a mechanism in the SEPI through which barriers to open dialogue are addressed? What structures or systems need to be in place to ensure that we are coming with respect and appreciation for a diversity of perspectives? So we come back here again to, as I said, self-reflection questions where you might be able to start hoping that this wheel may encourage you to start thinking about some of your different intersections and your identities that you bring and think about whether they're dominant more often or minority positions. And unlike in other presentations, we do not want to discuss these questions with you in real time over Zoom, but we feel it's very important to as we move forward in conversations, for us to individually think about the different hats that we're wearing. And this is going to be especially important as we start talking about two-eyed seeing in the next presentation. So for now, we just ask you to spend some time reflecting and thinking about your experiences and the perspectives that are present or challenged in the SEPI discussions, or which have been challenged over time, so that you're consciously thinking about the hats that you wear when you're at the SEPI table. We also want to encourage you to think about when you joined the SEPI or when you left and rejoined the SEPI. Are there periods when you felt disengaged or absent from conversations? Are there things that you believe to be true, but perhaps are framed by a specific period of time and maybe information needs to be updated? Are there stories that you'd like to know more about? And we encourage you to think about some of these questions as we move forward again into the next conversations about where the SEPI is going and what the SEPI should be doing. So finally, here is the schedule of upcoming events that we're going to be having as live Zoom conversations. We've listed the 6 topics that we will be discussing. Although you'll see this one, the third, individual identities and relationships, we're not going to be having a group discussion. So there's 5 upcoming discussions, and we encourage you to please contact Carolyn Barber to pre-register for these conversations, and she'll send you Zoom links so that we have a sense of who's going to be there and how many people for coordination purposes. So with that, Namoltis, Walalin, thank you, and we'll see you soon.